All right, let's get into this. Okay, doing some research on the 24th solar cycle, or solar cycle 24, whichever you want to, however you want to look at it. And interesting things, there's two crowds here that you got to discuss: the global warming crowd and the global cooling crowd. And where the warming and the cooling are taking place and stuff like that. Now, me, I try to look at everything as non-biased as I can, but I will tell you my bias is moving towards the cooling, and there's several reasons. Number one, everything's a cycle. This idea that anthropogenic, man-made global warming is what's causing all this. I don't really buy into that. That's about putting in a carbon tax. It's green communism, Agenda 21 stuff. That's exactly what it is. And it does seem that more and more scientists are ditching the global warming theory. Now, is there warming? Yes. Is it man-made? Probably not. And how much warming are we talking about? We're basically, if we're going by the Al Gore hockey stick, we should be standing on the surface of Mars. However, what they're saying is we're arguing about a tenth of a degree. So yes, it's not even a whole degree that they're arguing over. And where the warming is in the ocean and stuff is on the surface. It's not deep in the ocean where they said it was going to be. And also, it's the CO2 buildup in the atmosphere isn't where they said it was going to be. And human beings count for, with all the pollution that we put out, we count for less than 1% of the CO2, meaning volcanoes and bushfires and stuff like that way outclass us. We can't even hold it. You can never compete with Mother Nature. That said, the other thing is that they're also discovering that the Earth's mantle is cooling. And this is something that's happening that is pretty much in alignment with the solar cycles. Basically, and to me, it's a pretty much no-brainer. But when you have a less active solar cycle, you're going to get cooling. But there's other things that happen too. And right now, at the making of this video, we have the Nepal earthquake that happened, and that it was pretty bad, obviously. And Mount Everest, with the earthquake affecting avalanches on there. One of the things they've noticed in the cycles, if you go back, is that whenever there is a massive cooling phase, volcanic activity seems to go up. Now, it doesn't mean you get more more volcanoes, but you get more boom for the buck. So even if there's not as many like right now, volcanic activity isn't on the rise. It's just, but when it blows, it's bigger. Everything's bigger. The storms, there's not as many storms, but they're bigger. They're more powerful. Warm air meets cold air. Well, it's cold air that gives power to a storm. And scientists have always said that, if you want to see a big storm, it's when a massive cold front hits the warm. And if you look at where the actual hot air meets the cold air, a perfect example is basically this past winter, coldest in Canada since the 1880s. But however, in the BC, they pretty much had an early spring, and the rest of the country was still under 6 feet of snow. So yeah, you have to factor in that. Yes, regional climate doesn't dictate global climate. Yes, I understand that. Everybody understands that. Let's move on. But what the scientists are saying, basically, of the astrophysicists, I guess, or not astrophysicists, but I guess astrophysicists would be what you'd call them. They're saying that with the solar cycles, that what they're predicting is between, and it's starting now, is basically between the years 2012 to 2015 is the start of the cooling phase. Now, if we go back to 2012, we had the largest Arctic sea ice melt-off in recorded weather history, so to speak. That said, in 2013, it was larger than it's been since the 1980s. Then, of course, in 2014, again, the sea ice grew again by 46% larger than what it's been in a long time. Now, this actually aligns up with the 13th cycle of the solar cycle. Now, I forget how many cycles in total, but it's like 25 or so, and then everything starts over again if we track it back through the Earth's history. And it almost lines up perfectly with that one. Now, when we go through, are we in the warm period now? Well, there's the medieval warm period, which has a lot of debate going on that. Yes, it was warmer, but even warmer than that, if we go back about 3,000 years, it was really warm, like everywhere. And you have to understand, most of the Earth's history, we didn't have polar caps. Uh, but again, also too, most of the Earth's history, we wouldn't be able to survive on this planet anyway. And at the beginning of the Earth, so to speak, the day was only 4 hours long, but the planet would just happen to be molten lava at the time, so it wouldn't have been very hospitable to us anyway. The Earth is constantly slowing down. Now, when Mount St. Helens blew back in the 1980s or early 1990s, I can't remember whenever it blew, it slowed down the Earth's rotation ever so slightly and cooled the planet by 1 degree. Yeah, like that. So to say, that man-made global warming holds a candle to nature is just ridiculous. The other thing is the areas where it's warm, the areas where it's cold. One thing that I'm noticing, and this is just me. Now, they said in 2014 it was the hottest year on record, but where? This is where your problem lies. Again, people in California, yes, they're going through a drought right now. Now, I'm not saying that we don't manipulate the weather with, for example, with the chemtrails and stuff like that. Which, if you don't believe in chemtrails, then you just didn't do any research. I mean, after about, I don't know, 85 seconds of research, you'll figure out that, yeah, those things do exist. Why would the UN have a ban on them? Why does Monsanto have a aluminium resistant seed? And one of the main things that come out of the chemtrail planes, barium, strontium, aluminium. There we go. So it makes very big sense, that, okay, yeah, there is manipulation. And with HARP, basically, if you really think about what they're doing, is they're basically charging up the atmosphere to block weather patterns. But that also, yes, you could say that's manipulating, but it doesn't really change. It changes the weather patterns a bit, but it doesn't really actually change the climate to the point of, how's the best way to put it? It doesn't change the climate to what you want it to be. It goes screwy at that point. So that's why you'll get warming over here and cold over there. That said, even with that, the chemtrails don't hold it. They don't hold a candle to Mother Nature. Nothing does. And when you look at the jet stream, yes, the jet stream does fly down a lot further than what it used to and goes up a lot higher than what it does. So it means the air gets sucked up to the Arctic and get pushed down again. And, it goes, pretty much all around the world. And then you had those big polar vortexes, which was coined back in the 1960s or whatever. And these polar vortexes are basically, they're not nothing new in our history. We've had them, before. I mean, when I was a kid, it was always snow till May. Mid-May was spring, not, end of February, in my area. The snowbanks were a lot higher than when I was a kid. Now I'm in my 40s, but, the snowbanks were a hell of a lot higher than when I was a kid. Now we're starting to go through that cycle again. Now, what they're calling for is global cooling between, 2015, 2017 to roughly 2035, meaning food prices are going to go up because we're going to have a shorter growing season. Doesn't necessarily mean ice age, but it doesn't mean that some areas won't have longer than normal winters. And we can see it in two ways. That the cold air displaces the hot air, right? So what's happening, and this is my theory, is that all that cold air that we experienced over the winter, the jet stream just pushes all the hot air to the south, and it just stays there stagnant. So where the hot air is staying stagnant, it gets twice as hot, and then you get your drought and whatever. And when you have dry Arctic air coming down, that doesn't help either, because it sucks all the moisture out of the ground and everything. So you got that where it looks like it's where if you're around the equator, it looks like it's getting even, warmer and global warming. But if you're just slightly above that, it's still cool. I mean, there's still places in Canada, out east, particularly like in Newfoundland, places like that. I was talking to friends, like, yeah, can't go fishing yet because the lakes are still froze over, in some places. So it's, yes, I get it. Regionally, it's different. But when you look at the cold areas, if you balance it off hot between cold, where it's cold, it's twice as cold. Where it's hot, it's twice as hot. It's because nothing's moving. That's why the warm air isn't going up. Now, that said, right now, yes, the Arctic sea ice is melting off because it's spring again, but the icebreakers are still having a hard time getting through. Yes, it depends on what side of the globe you're on. Certain parts of the Arctic is wide open right now. Other parts won't be passable for another few weeks. So yeah, there's a cycle, and there's also seasons, so we got to take that into account. But I believe the trend is going to be cooler, and it seems to be cooler. The past couple of years in my area, it's been cooler for sure. There's no doubt about that. I mean, even last year in Toronto, for example, which is a major Canadian city, there didn't have one day in it was either June or July over 30 degrees. That's like unheard of. Even in Ottawa, like where I lived for years, I mean, pretty much it's like 45 degrees every single day because of the pavement and all that. It's just ridiculously hot all the time. So that is telling you something. And all cities are kind of the same. Pavement cooks you. You know what I mean? And now, as far as the sea ice getting bigger, over the past 2 years, yes, I do understand that sea ice is not as thick as it once was, but that's the thing. It will replenish. And the idea, oh, well, the Arctic is melting, is melting. Here's the thing and I guess maybe for the global warming side of the crowd, they have a very short-term memory. Because you have to understand, since the last ice age, the Arctic has been melting big time. And again, we didn't have Arctic or polar caps for most of the Earth's history. So the idea that it's all man-made is just ridiculous. So what is this whole carbon tax thing about? Well, the cap and trade carbon tax thing that they're implementing here in Quebec and in Ontario and in BC, in accordance with basically California, it has to do with the Agenda 21 stuff. What it does is it takes a company that doesn't pollute as much, they give them so-called credits, you can call it cash if you want, and they take a company that doesn't or does pollute a lot, and they can buy carbon credits from different companies. And the idea is that it'll be more expensive for this company to run, so you'll get a zero somewhere. These guys get credit for not polluting, and these guys can pay to pollute. So in actuality, actually nothing changes whatsoever. Just a lot of people make money. So for all these people that are heavy into the global warming or climate change or whatever you want to, and the fact that they call it climate change now is because they can't really claim warming. In some areas, it hasn't warmed in like 20 years or 18 or 19 years, whatever it is. There's been no warming. So again, it's where is the warming? How much warming we talk about, even where it is slightly warmer, where you can say, okay, the global average temperatures are higher, but it's only in certain areas that really give us that extra temperature. And if we're arguing over the semantics of a tenth of a degree, it really, that's far from an extinction level event. You know what I mean? If we're talking what they're predicting now, hopefully, again, you have to understand both sides do doctor the numbers. I get that, but that's why the best thing is you look at what they're predicting and just look at what actually happened, and that you can only do from after the math. You know what I mean? Like after the event, so to speak. Now, what they're claiming, and I hope this is not true, but they're saying that it may reduce the global temperature by up to 5 degrees. So if our average global temperatures are 5 degrees cooler, we're talking possibly a small ice age in certain areas. More northern climates like here in Canada, you're talking about snow in June. You know what I mean? You're talking a really long winter. Anybody on the Great Lakes, if you thought you got it bad this year, just wait till next year. The snow's going to be 12 feet instead of 6 feet. You know what I mean? And they were getting 6 feet at a time. So again, when you look at it, if you follow the cycle, the last time this happened, again was when the sun went into a kind of less dormant active. And in 2011, when the polarity of the sun flipped, it was the starting of a new cycle. And that cycle basically is a cooling cycle. Now, there's another thing to keep in mind too. The Earth is now on the going on its orbit that actually takes it slightly further away from the sun, and that orbit actually is the same orbit that we were entering when we were heading into the last ice age. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight, but you have to understand it kind of does happen fast. Here's the thing: the last ice age was 10,000 years. The ice age before that, I think, was like 25,000 years. Don't quote me on the years, but it was something like that. So 10,000 years. But through core sampling of drilling the ice cores, what they found was that the last ice age didn't take thousands of years to come in. It only took 3 years. So again, we don't hold a candle to nature. When she decides to change, she will change. And if you think a little bit of CO2, which plants actually like, in the atmosphere is going to actually create such a greenhouse gas warming that, again, it can be offset. Yes, I'm aware of the methane bubbles up in the Arctic. I'm aware of all that stuff. But you have to understand, this stuff has always been going on. And the Earth changes. If, for example, Grossmore National Park, if that thing were to ever, not Grossmore, sorry, Yellowstone Park were to ever blow, well, we draw the Earth's would be covered. The atmosphere would be basically volcanic ash around the planet. It would You would get so much global dimming that we would probably drop 10 degrees globally. That's an extinction level event right there. Meaning the only place maybe you'd probably have like 100-mile stretch off the equator, north or south, that you could actually grow stuff. The rest would be under like about 9 miles of ice over, in 100 years, it'd be like 9 miles of ice everywhere. It'd be maybe not that much ice, but you never know. You have to understand, at one point, the Earth was covered in about 10 miles or more of ice. The whole planet, and it took billions of years for us to thaw out. And after that, we went into like a super acid rain phase, where because of the volcanic activity. But there's again, things change. With volcanic activity in the cool periods, well, maybe it's that acid rain that kind of thaws things out. But the problem is with acid rain, it's not very good for the environment, and it actually not very good for us either. So these are the things that you can see the cycle of it. And again, when we're looking at the earthquakes like Fukushima and stuff like that, it corresponds more with the sun changing its temper, so to speak, and becoming into a less active cycle. Now, with Fukushima, you have to understand, Japan itself sunk like 6 inches, and we actually lost like a sixth of a second off the day. Usually when these big events happen, it slows the rotation of the Earth ever so slightly. Barely noticeable to the average person on a daily basis, but scientifically, yes. Now, you add this up over thousands of years, the Earth gradually slows. Again, at first we had, when our moon actually, predicted to have smacked into us, at that point we had a 4-hour day, and we're now at a 24-hour day, give or take, a few milliseconds here or there. And so when you look at it like that, things are always changing. So if the Earth is always changing and there's cycles as the Earth is changing, of course we're going to experience things that we can't necessarily 100% come up with the answers for. Polar bears. Let's talk about polar bears. 1950s, there was only a few thousand of them. Now there's like 25,000 of them. People, up in Arctic Bay and Alert and places like that. Like I have relatives that travel up there, for work and stuff like that every now and then. They come back and it's like the natives tell them all the time, or the Inuit are telling them all the time, yeah, there's more polar bears now than there's ever been, But and there was a guy, I think in 2010 or whatever, he wanted to know for sure, and he was, a biologist or whatever, and he's flying around and it's like, all you see is polar bears, and it's because the Arctic ice is melting and they're all driven south. But I mean, you're in Alert. That's not south. That's about as north as you can get. You go any further, you're going to fall off the edge of the planet. You know what I'm saying? Or you land in Russia, one or the other. So again, it's the global warming cloud has spent like $30 billion on this, or more. Who knows how much they actually spent on, but something like $30 billion on this whole global warming initiative. For them to admit they're wrong now, that's pretty costly. And of course, science has become political, which you're never going to get non-biased science if it's political. But the scientists that keep coming out, against global warming, most of them were global warming supporters at one point. But what they're saying, it's not so cut and dry. We're not on the surface of Mars. That could happen, sure. Maybe some solar event happens and whatever, and the sun flares up. We're going to be, have to wear 8,000 sunblock. You know what I mean? But we don't have all the variables, and the climate models are not exactly with the feedback loops. They're wonky science. What the science predicts and what you're actually seeing is not the same thing. And the other thing is I'm not saying people's man-made pollution isn't a problem, but what I'm saying is if you take up the biggest polluters on the planet, China, India, I mean, these people, China builds like 2 coal plants a week. No scrubbers in their stacks, type of thing. We're talking burning raw coal into the atmosphere. Okay, and those people share the same planet as us. Okay, now we put restrictions on North American companies, pretty much regulate them out of business, so that we don't manufacture hardly anything in Canada or the United States. And we're saying, okay, well, because we care about the environment so much, we're going to regulate do this global warming initiative and regulate people out, but yet we'll send all the jobs overseas just so you don't see how disastrous the. I mean, China's pretty much poisoned its water. They got like smog alerts like crazy. It's just horrible what they're doing over there. It's just because it's politically incorrect to do it here. But here's the other problem with that. Even with all that pollution, including us, including everything, we don't even count for 1%. So again, this idea that the global warming crowd has, I mean, just the idea that they want to make it illegal in places like Britain to be a climate change denier. Well, I don't think anybody's really denying that the climate changes. In fact, that's the whole point. The climate does change. It changes all the time. It changes with variables we don't yet understand. I mean, look at your local weatherman. How often, not he gets it right, but he gets it wrong. Okay, and you're trusting these scientists, you know what I mean? But again, you just look at the cycles, and it seems to correlate more with the activity of the sun than anything. So it doesn't mean we're never going to hit a warming phase. It doesn't even mean we're not going to have hot years. But just look where the warming is. Yes, the southern states, they've had hotter droughts and stuff like that. But look at the 1930s Dust Bowls. And stuff like that. It was much hotter back then. But look at the 1940s. We're pretty much in a deep freeze. The 1970s, a deep freeze again. The 1980s, getting kind of toasty. 1990s was hotter than what it is now in a lot of places. Now we're kind of going back to the 1800s again in that cycle, which would go back to about where the 1830s is with the Dalton. I think it's the Dalton cycle or whatever. There's a lot of things to look at, but the solar cycle 24, I think, kind of puts a nail in the coffin of the global warming thing. So that, should you be not concerned about it anymore? No, actually, it's kind of the opposite. And here's the rub: whether you're into the global climate change crowd, global warming crowd, global climate change crowd, or the climate change denier, whichever, it doesn't really matter. Or you're into the global cooling. All of them, okay, have one thing in common. And if you can take anything out of this video, even if you disagree with absolutely everything I say, here's one thing. Let's say the global warming crowd is right. It's bad, right? Oh, of course. Of course it's going to be bad. Why? Because it means we're talking about drought. What happens in drought? You can't grow food. That's a bad thing. That means world starvation. And if we look at the past couple of decades, the last past couple of years, pretty much from about 2009 on, we've been seeing bigger and bigger food shortages, pretty much in the third world. And we've been seeing things like frost in Texas and Mexico destroying crops, right? And then, of course, we got the major, which was more of a mismanaged crisis in California with the water, which basically is a manufactured crisis to the point where it's actually led to a massive drought in California. Okay, you look at that. So we got drought. So you're talking food shortage, no matter which on the global warming side of it. Okay, what about the global cooling crowd? What if they're right? Well, again, we're in another problem. Now you're talking about shorter growing seasons. For the average person who may not know this, the typical garden, okay, your potatoes, your lettuce, your tomatoes, that type of thing. We're talking 16 weeks for an average edible garden. That's 16 weeks. So if we're talking a place that normally would get 2, maybe 3 crops a year, maybe some places get crops all year round. If we're talking a cooling phase, we're talking things that not only will not grow just because it doesn't get warm enough. For example, some years I can grow hot peppers. Other years it just like the plant grows and it blossoms, but nothing happens because it just doesn't get hot enough here to grow that. Particularly South America, they're great at growing fruits, but a lot of vegetables they can't grow because it's the opposite. It's too hot. It's too warm. So there's always things that will grow better in some places than others. But when we're looking at it, if we're talking global cooling, then we're actually in a worse scenario because now it's not only a matter of drought, where you're worried about water. This is just a matter of, can you grow something? It's just too cold. The ground's frozen too late. You just can't get a long enough. Your garden gets taken out by a frost in June. And for example, here where I'm at, it's kind of from a gardening point of view, it's called Zone 3 here in I think it's called Zone 3 here in Quebec, which is just kind of basically the latitude for growing the plants here. Most people don't put their garden in until after the 15th of June. Okay, so from June to roughly August, September. Sometimes you can get a frost in September, so you might get at best one crop in. So in Canada, they typically the fields are big. Make the first one. If they get two crops, they're really, really laughing. But that said, we also have to take into another thing into account. 80% of the crops in the United States, and probably Canada too, are basically grown corn for ethanol, meaning they're non-edible. They're non-edible crops. Uh, that's a bad. That really puts your food supply chain dangerously low. Meaning most what they used to do is have at least 2 years of wheat and grain and stuff like that supply ahead of each crop to account for crop failures. Now they're cutting it down to months, and they've been doing this for the last past 5-10 years, that type of thing. Now, with that said, the other problem you have is if we go from the year 1900 to now, in Canada, United States, there's maybe about 3% of the farmers there used to be. Now, we also have to look. The last time that we were in a cycle similar to this, which was solar cycle 13, I believe, that was kind of mimicking almost the same uh, graph for temperature as what we're starting to experience now. In the 1800s, early 1800s, like the 1830s or whatever, it was cold. It was really cold. Millions starved to death because of that. And that's back when people were basically off the grid and as self-reliant as possible. Even the people in the city had gardens. The cities of their time. That small town. Everybody was self-reliant. Everybody canned food. Everybody hunted. Everybody fished. Everybody trapped. Everybody did these things. And not only that, they always saved for the rainy days. Now, what do we have now? Well, most people eat a 1,400-mile salad. And that is a big problem if we're talking about particularly global cooling. With global warming, one advantage you can get is the fact that it's warm. And water, yes, is a problem, but you can kind of offset that by, growing things actually in a shadier area, conserving water in different ways. It's still bad. Don't get me wrong, but they can grow food in the desert if they can get the water to it. That's already been proven by permaculture. It's a doable thing. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's doable. But however, you can just never grow a garden in the Arctic unless it's indoors. That's the only way you can do it. So hydroponics and that type of thing, indoor gardens, big greenhouses. That's the only thing that can sustain, and artificial light. That's the only thing that's going to be able to sustain people up in the Arctic. Next to that, they have to have everything pretty much, flown in. In fact, up in the Arctic, almost everything runs off of generators because you can't get hydro up there, that type of thing. Hydro doesn't work when the whole river's frozen solid. Down like 9 feet of ice type of thing. So with that, this is where the big problem comes in. If we're heading into a cooling phase between what the scientists are claiming now, between 2017, we're really going to start noticing it's getting colder, to 2035. Then what we're looking at is a lot of people who may possibly just starve to death, not because they can't afford food, it's just that there will not be a large enough supply. And one of the things that the World Food Organization has been screaming about the past couple of years is that there's a food shortage. And of course, they cut off the third world first. A third world, usually ends up getting food from these organizations and stuff like that. And they're going to cut them off first. So the third world is going to starve off first because, again, they're not self-reliant either. They're relying on, C-130s dropping off bags of wheat, corn, rice, whatever. That said, over here, we're not that much better off. Yeah, we're more advanced, but even the people in the countrysides now, they don't grow a garden anymore. Now, you have a better chance if you have food put away and you have some property that you can actually start to grow things. But what happens during a food crisis? Well, you can pretty much figure out how desperate people can get. Try going a day without eating, and then just imagine, a week. And law of threes: 3 minutes without air, the typical person dies. 3 days without water, the typical person dies. 3 weeks without food, the average person dies. Your mileage might vary. So maybe you'll last 4 minutes. Maybe you'll last 4 days. Maybe you'll last 40 days. Whatever. But a U.S. experiment that they did with soldiers back in the 1950s or early 1960s, whichever it was, doing a controlled starvation diet for, I think it was up to 60 people for 60 days. And after the first 30 days, most of these soldiers were deeply depressed, definitely starving, and lost, like about 10% of their body weight or something crazy like that. And almost all of them, every single one of them, had thoughts of cannibalism. Very terrifying. The movie The Road kind of comes to mind at this point. Kill or be killed for food. But the thing is it's the haves and the have-nots. If you're perceived as a have, you are in trouble. Why? Because people will steal, and Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, you pick one. It all shows the same thing. Before Hurricane Katrina, FEMA would say things like the average grocery store will be out of groceries within 3 to 4 days. And they would be right if people were civil. But in Hurricane Katrina, it was 3 to 4 hours. Okay, that's what desperate people do. And the worst part is how much stuff came out of those stores, that went to waste. People just grabbing as much as they could carry, meats, everything like that, and it all went bad. I mean, think about it. So after that, you got people roving around, starving to death. You're going to have a lot of violence on your hand, a lot of civil unrest. So whether you're in the global cooling or the global warming, to me, it's not really that relevant. What you need to look at is that if either side is right, what are you prepared? Do you have, something, enough food put away for you and your family? Again, I keep plugging rice. $10, $10, you can buy an 18-pound bag of rice. Buy $100 worth. Okay, if I'm wrong, okay, no big deal. You still win. Why? You got food in your house. You can use that. If I'm right, you're gonna thank me. Because what are you looking for? You're looking to get that 16 weeks to be able to grow a crop somewhere. But what happens if the food crisis hits in January? And you were in Canada? The average person eats day to day in the city. I know when I lived in the city, okay, I have a loaf of bread and a thing of hot dogs in the freezer. That's it, but you go out, you go eat over here, you go eat over there. Now, most people can never grasp the concept that the food supply can run out. But you have to look at it more like society is kind of like a canary in a cage, or a budgie bird in a cage. And that supermarket is our food. Okay, we go there, we get our food, we come back. But it's always magically replenished at some point. The water thing is always magically replenished. Okay, so when you have that kind of frame of mind, you can never ever get into the idea that yes, this can happen here, and it has happened. I mean, here in Canada, people starved to death in the early 1700s, 1800s as well. I mean, the Irish famine, when the people came over here, they still didn't have enough, food, and people. Many, I think something like the church in Montreal, people would drop off their babies, particularly the Irish that were coming in from the potato famine. They couldn't feed them. And out of 735 babies, only something like 30 lived because they were so malnourished, just left on the church step, and they didn't have enough food. So again, 16 weeks to grow a crop, that's 4 months. Okay, so you need to be able to have enough food to not only ride that out, but and because your crop can fail. This is the thing, and if we're talking about global cooling, we're talking about powerful storms where the hot air meets the cold air. And if we look, even just this winter, if you look where that hot kind of cold air kind of met, that's where the worst snow was. Where I was, it was cold. It was really cold, but it was very dry. It was like Arctic dry here. We got lots of snow, don't get me wrong, but more snow than last year and the year before. But what was really different this time was how dry it was. That's why the melt-off we got now, we might actually have, when the warm weather does get here, we're probably going to have a bit of a water problem here because it's probably going to get really, really dry unless we start getting rain, which normally we usually get a fair amount of rain. But dry snow doesn't necessarily mean dry summer, but I've noticed that's usually the way it is. If you have heavy wet snow, you have a rainy summer. If you have really dry snow, like crusty kind of styrofoam type of stuff like we had this year, usually that means in my area it's going to be very, very hot and dry. If you see snow devils, they look like a dust devil, but a snow devil, that means tornado-y season. But that said, we're still that hot air that's stuck in the middle of the earth, so to speak, because that really cold, extra cold Arctic air won't let it pass anywhere. That's where the big storms are. And if you follow the jet stream where the hot meets the cold, it's always the same. It's that's where the big storms are going to be. and this is what you need to prepare for. So it's a topic that I know a lot gets a lot of people heated up, and it's a good debate and stuff like that. I again am more into the global cooling crowd. I don't subscribe to any of these. And again, one thing not one single politician will ever tell you is exactly how a carbon tax will save the earth. They don't. They give you this nifty cap and trade and zero sum balance. They use a lot of buzzwords, but at the end of the day, the polluters still pollute. And the only thing that happens is politicians make a whole bunch of money out of it, and they tax you. And if you look at the 10 pillars of communism, and progressivism is pretty much the new communism now, and Agenda 21, you can call that green communism, the Earth Summit of 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. One of the big things is to tax people with a progressive tax so that they gradually get so poor they don't have any property, and they tax you off your land and everything like that. It's a form of control, and it's actually a form of genocide. So the thing is, if you're relying on these global scientists, again, if they have to make it illegal because you deny it, then there's probably a problem with that. Again, more and more scientists are jumping off the global warming thing. Yes, we had some warming, but how much warming? Insignificant. CO2, again, parts per million, we're like 1,000 parts per million, thousands of parts per million below what is considered lethal. You know what I mean? Like it's wonky science. It is what it is. But however, if you follow the cycles of the sun, it looks a little bit more. So it's not an exact cycle, line for line, but it's close enough that you can see the pattern and the trend and say, okay, well, this is a good indicator. And one of the big things that they noticed in a cooling phase with the sun in a cooling phase, again, is powerful volcanoes. So not necessarily more volcanic activity, but more, big eruptions. So, and if we got lots of volcanic activity, then you're talking about global dimming. And if we got more global dimming, less sun hits the Earth. And if less sun hits the Earth, we got cooling. And if we got cooling, we got cold. We got cold, we have short growing seasons. We have short growing seasons, well, you get the idea. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. So if you like this kind of content, please consider making a donation to the channel. Thank you so much to everybody who has. It does help, and that is for the channel. Whether you agree with me, disagree with me, whatever, please leave your comment. I mean, that's one of the best things about YouTube is that you can actually interact with the, the host of the video type of thing. And I love to hear from you guys, even if I can't get back to every one of you. I do appreciate the comments, and try to keep it civil, argue amongst yourselves, whatever. I don't censor my comments. I don't believe in censorship, but like anything, try to keep it civil. Next to that, rate, subscribe, share, comment, like, be true to yourself, be true to others. Always do the right thing, and have yourselves a great day. G'day, hi, and welcome. All right, let's get into this. Okay, doing some research on the 24th solar cycle, or solar cycle 24, however you want to look at it. And interesting things, there's two crowds here that you got to discuss: the global warming crowd and the global cooling crowd, and where the warming and the cooling are taking place and stuff like that. Now, I try to look at everything as non-biased as I can, but I will tell you my bias is moving towards the cooling, and there's several reasons. Number one, everything's a cycle. This idea that anthropogenic, man-made global warming is what's causing all this, I don't really buy into that. That's about putting in a carbon tax. It's green communism, Agenda 21 stuff. That's exactly what it is. And it does seem that more and more scientists are ditching the global warming theory. Now, is there warming? Yes. Is it man-made? Probably not. And how much warming are we talking about? We're basically, if we're going by the Al Gore hockey stick, we should be standing on the surface of Mars. However, what they're saying is we're arguing about 1/10 of a degree. So yes, it's not even a whole degree that they're arguing over. And where the warming is in the ocean and stuff is on the surface. It's not deep in the ocean where they said it was going to be. And also, it's the CO2 buildup in the atmosphere isn't where they said it was going to be. And human beings count for, with all the pollution that we put out, we count for less than 1% of the CO2, meaning volcanoes and bushfires and stuff like that way outclass us. We can't even hold it. You can never compete with Mother Nature. That said, the other thing is that they're also discovering that the Earth's mantle is cooling. And this is something that's happening that is pretty much in alignment with the solar cycles. basically, and you know, to me, it's a pretty much no-brainer. But when you have a less active solar cycle, you're going to get cooling. But there's other things that happen too. And right now, at the making of this video, we have the Nepal earthquake that happened, and that it was pretty bad, obviously. And Mount Everest, with the earthquake affecting Mount, avalanches on there. Uh, One of the things they've noticed in the cycles, if you go back, is that whenever there is a massive cooling phase, volcanic activity seems to go up. Now, it doesn't mean you get more volcanoes, but you get more boom for the buck. So even if there's not as many like right now, volcanic activity isn't on the rise. It's just, but when it blows, it's bigger. Everything's bigger. The storms, there's not as many storms, but they're bigger. They're more powerful. Warm air meets cold air. Well, it's cold air that gives power to a storm. And scientists have always said that, if you want to see a big storm, it's when a massive cold front hits the warm. And if you look at where the actual hot air meets the cold air, a perfect example is basically this past winter, coldest in Canada since the 1880s. But however, in the BC they pretty much had an early spring, and the rest of the country was still under 6 feet of snow. So yeah, you have to factor in that. Yes, regional climate doesn't dictate global climate. Yes, I understand that. Everybody understands that. Let's move on. But what the scientists are saying, basically of the astrophysicists, I guess, or not astrophysicists, but I guess astrophysicists would be what you'd call them. They're saying that with the solar cycles, that what they're predicting is and it's starting now, is basically between the years 2012 to 2015 is the start of the cooling phase. Now, if we go back to 2012, we had the largest Arctic sea ice melt-off in recorded weather history, so to speak. That said, in 2013, it was larger than it's been since the 1980s. Then, of course, in 2014, again, the sea ice grew again by 46% larger than what it's been in a long time. Now, this actually aligns up with the 13th cycle of the solar cycle. Now, I forget how many cycles in total, but it's like 25 or so, and then everything starts over again if we track it back through the Earth's history. And it almost lines up perfectly with that one. Now, when we go through, are we in the warm period now? Well, there's the medieval warm period, which has a lot of debate going on that. Yes, it was warmer, but even warmer than that, if we go back about 3,000 years, it was really warm, like everywhere. And you have to understand, most of the Earth's history, we didn't have polar caps. But again, also too, most of the Earth's history, we wouldn't be able to survive on this planet anyway. And at the beginning of the Earth, so to speak, the day was only 4 hours long, but the planet would just happen to be molten lava at the time, so it wouldn't have been very hospitable to us anyway. The Earth is constantly slowing down. Now, when Mount St. Helens blew back in the 1980s, or early 1990s, I can't remember whenever it blew, it slowed down the Earth's rotation ever so slightly and cooled the planet